let's make a start. So we'll start nice and promptly and then hopefully finish on time this afternoon. So welcome everybody, thank you very much for coming. I'm Chloe Peacock. I'm a Senior Research Associate and Postdoctoral Fellow in the School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies at the University of Bristol. I'm also a member of SPIN, which is the Secrecy, Power and Ignorance Research Network. It's a multidisciplinary network spanning several institutions based in the southwest of England, made up of scholars at all levels and with a broad set of interests and expertise. All committed to understanding the power of unknowing in different ways. I'm standing in this afternoon for my colleague Elsbeth van Veeren, who's unfortunately unwell and not able to join us. I know that she had really enjoyed reading Emily's book this week and was really disappointed to have to miss today's event. So I've stepped in, apologies in advance if there are any kind of hitches, but I think we should work it out as we go along. So this afternoon, I'm really delighted to welcome you to the next event in our series, which is funded by and co-hosted with the Southwest Doctoral Training Partnership. Over the coming 18 months, we're working to deliver a series of lectures, panels and workshops on the theme of secrecy and ignorance to support the development of this exciting line of research. So today we're really pleased to welcome Professor Emily van Duyn from the University of Illinois to learn more about her new book, Democracy Lives in Darkness. So Emily's going to talk to us for about 45 minutes or so today, and then we'll have some time for questions afterwards. So make a note of questions as we go and drop them into the chat. And Evelyn from SPIN is going to kind of keep an eye on the chat and make a note of any questions, and we'll have time to come back to some of them at the end. Just to make you aware, we're going to be recording today's event so that people who can't make it today can come back and watch it. If you'd rather not be recorded, or you'd rather not have your name mentioned, please drop us an email and we can cut that from the recording. I think Evelyn has, yeah, Evelyn's just popped a message in the chat about that as well. And of course you can turn off your camera and microphone as well if you'd rather not be recorded. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to introduce Emily properly. So Emily van Duyn is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Before moving to Illinois, Emily earned her PhD in Communication Studies at the University of Texas at Austin and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford University with the program on democracy and the internet. Emily's research explores why people talk or don't talk about politics, and the role of digital media in facilitating a space for community and political discourse. She tackles these questions using diverse methodologies, including surveys, experiments, interviews, and ethnography. And her book with Oxford University Press, Democracy Lives in Darkness, How and Why People Keep Their Politics a Secret, focuses on the reasons why individuals don't express their political opinions in public and how they express those opinions and organise in secret. Across 2 years, she follows a secret group of progressives in rural Texas who, out of fear of their conservative community, meet in secret to talk about politics and take political action. Her work is concerned with the effects of social, geographic and political polarisation and how these phenomena threaten liberal democratic norms. Emily, we're really delighted to welcome you and looking forward to hearing more about your work. So I'll hand over to you now. Thanks very much.
Thank you for that introduction, Chloe. I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay, wonderful. So I am delighted to be here today to speak with you guys about my recent book, as Chloe mentioned, which is titled Democracy Lives in Darkness: How and Why People Keep Their Politics a Secret. I am a current assistant professor at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in the Department of Communication, where I study political communication and digital media. So it's nice to kind of step out of just the communication world and hear from different perspectives on secrecy. As I'll kind of talk about today, it's not something that is super central to the work in political communication. So I borrow a lot from other disciplines. So I'm eager to hear your feedback. So I'd like to start today off with a story. It is August of 2017, and I am somewhere in the state of Texas. If you have never traveled to Texas in August, I recommend to never do that. It is notoriously the hottest month of the year. This August, I am attending the meeting of a secret political organization in rural Texas, who I have been invited for the first time by leaders of this organization after I kind of gained access and started interviewing several of the group's leaders. The group is sitting in kind of a semicircle. They're facing the front. They start with a Pledge of Allegiance, and they read aloud a confidentiality agreement that prohibits any of the members from speaking the name of the group or members of the group to anyone outside. Most of the people in this circle and in this group are white women. Most of them are Democrats. Some of them are disaffected Republicans. But what the whole group has in common is that they didn't vote for Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential election. Many of them, though, go home to husbands who did vote for Donald Trump or work for employers who did. All of them live in a county in the state of Texas that went over 75% for Trump in 2016. So this is the room that I find myself in, and this is the group that is really at the heart of my book, and what led me to start exploring these ideas of political secrecy and political expression more broadly. The book has a lot more than what I can cover here. It has a chapter on how the group formed, their media consumption, a chapter on their negotiations as an organization, how they made decisions together. It also has a chapter on the group's incubation and how they revitalized their local party. When I first discovered the group, I approached my study and my understanding of them through the lens of silence, right? So why people don't express their beliefs. But what I really came to understand from all of my observations is that there is a really important distinction between silence and secrecy. And this is something that I don't think I had quite a grasp on, and something that I'll argue here today, that this distinction is actually really, really important when we're thinking about communication and expression about politics, that these two things are very, very different. To say that the women in the room in rural Texas, where I found myself in August, to say that they were silent really wasn't the full story of their experience, right? They were active, they were expressive, they were persisting despite being afraid, but they weren't silent about their politics altogether, right? They were just keeping them a secret from some. So in today's talk, I have several goals here. The first thing I want to do is to talk about this group as a reflection of political secrecy in rural Texas. I also want to talk about what I've found with regard to political secrecy in the United States more broadly. Then I'd like to talk about how those things tell us how we should conceptualize secrecy, and secrecy specifically about politics. Then I'd like to think about, well, what does that tell us about how we can understand political secrecy through research? And then how can we also understand it in practice and apply that understanding in practical contexts? So from 2017 to 2020, I followed this secret group in rural Texas, which I call Community Women's Group, or CWG for short. Just a little bit about the group before I kind of jump into what I found and what that can tell us about political secrecy. The group is comprised of 136 registered members, all of whom are mostly white, mostly middle to older age women. The group has a very specific mission statement, which lists 3 main goals of the organization for its members. The first is that it's to support members. The second is to educate members. And the third is to encourage them to take action. The group has, importantly, a confidentiality agreement. Each member must actually sign and agree to this confidentiality agreement before they join. And they actually read this aloud at each meeting, and it's posted up at the front of the room where they're meeting. And the confidentiality agreement says kind of 3 main things. The first is that they don't share the name of the group or names of the members to anyone outside of the group. The second is that they only recruit people who they know well and that they know to be of like mind. The third is that they don't publish anything about the group without explicit permission from members. All of these elements of that confidentiality agreement are very, very crucial to them maintaining the secrecy that I'll talk about today. The other thing that I'll note about this group is that they were formed using digital media. So when I say that, it means they used private email to originally organize each other together. And they also created a secret Facebook group, which they actually still run today to kind of communicate in between meetings. And if you're unfamiliar with a secret Facebook group, this differs in some pretty critical ways from a public group on Facebook because it's not searchable. You literally cannot find it on the network without already being invited by somebody. So this secret Facebook group is not visible to anyone in their networks without getting an invitation to join. So interestingly enough, this is an offline group who very much use digital tools to organize and communicate in secret. And we'll talk about that, or I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So as I began to learn about the women and the reasons behind why they were keeping their politics a secret and why they had formed this kind of formal secret political organization, I began to kind of make sense of how they fit into what we already know. Like what is their experience? How does that match what we already know about political expression and communication? And so I drew a lot from some existing work that I want to highlight here. The first of this work is what we know about discussion networks. So we know from a bunch of different research, mostly offline, that the composition of your discussion network matters to political expression and to participation. So if we are around people who disagree with us, that can affect how likely we are to express ourselves or to communicate, or how likely we are to participate. We also know that from the spiral of silence theory, that people typically withhold their political beliefs when they perceive that they're in the political minority. So when somebody thinks, I'm in the minority of the group around me, I'm going to withhold my beliefs, I will not express them. And that they do this out of fear of social isolation, that there's this worry that there will be social sanctions for expressing a dissenting opinion, and so therefore people withhold that. And for the most part, we have some pretty, reasonable evidence over time that spiral of silence actually does happen. It's not a huge effect, but for the most part, we have evidence to suggest that people really do this, that in the face of feeling like they're in the minority, they withhold their beliefs. And the other thing that we know, and kind of a growing body of literature here, is that political polarization, particularly in the US, is very much being driven by sorting. And when I say sorting, I mean both social and geographic sorting. So here I'm thinking of work from Liliana Mason and Bill Bishop that say that people are both socially and geographically sorting into political groups. And what that means is that on the social side, people are part of social groups that are increasingly correlated or aligned with a particular party or ideology. And the geographic side of things, it means that they are physically living in places where people share their political beliefs. And so both of these things, when we're surrounded by people in our social groups who support our politics, and we're physically surrounded by people who support our politics, creates a situation of risk, that there becomes this kind of risk to expressing political dissent, and that this isn't just for people on the extreme, right? The far right or the far left, but even mainstream partisans. So my argument today is not just that this is happening, secrecy driven by polarization and sorting is happening for those on the far right or far left, but people who are pretty average Democrats or Republicans in the United States. So as I spoke to the women over the years, I approached my understanding with those literatures, right? That idea that we are driven by those around us in our social groups and our geographic groups, and that affects what we do and what we say. And as I heard the women talk a little bit about why they wanted to keep their politics a secret, or why they joined a secret political organization, I found that the fear that they talked about did kind of reflect some of the stuff that we already know. So I did see that for the most part, the women expressed some fear of social isolation for expressing public dissent. So they did express this kind of spiral of silency reaction to not wanting to express themselves out of fear that they would be socially isolated. So here's an example from Deborah, who was actually one of the founding members of the group. And she told me she's avoided getting involved in politics here. She was an election judge for the Democratic Party for like 12 or 13 years, but that people started to come into the voting hall and they would see her at the Democratic table and they started to be rude to her. And so that did affect, you know, how willing she was to be engaged. And she said she kind of laid low after that. So here we can kind of see she's grappling with this, like, I'm part of this social community. I'm being kind of shunned for participating in the Democratic side of things when most everybody in my community is a Republican. And so I'm just not going to engage anymore. I also heard this from Virginia, who told me that for the most part, when people come in to vote, that they have to declare a party, right? So they would come to the table and say, if they're voting in a primary, they would have to say, I'm voting for the Democratic ticket or I'm voting for the Republican ticket. But as you can imagine, in a small community or in a place where most people know each other, when you come in and you declare that, you're not just declaring that to a random person, you're declaring that potentially to somebody who is a neighbor or a client or someone that you know from church. And so this becomes actually quite an outing thing. And actually they use that language in terms of outing themselves as Democrats to their community. And she told me that because people were so worried about being seen as a Democrat from people in their community, that many of them voted absentee. So they actually submitted by mail their preferences for voting, so they didn't have to go and have this kind of like social unveiling of their party. So I heard the social element to people's fear, but then I started to hear some things that didn't sound quite like they fit into that existing understanding of how people come to be afraid, or what they fear, or why they approach secrecy to begin with. And the other fear that I heard from them was this economic fear, this like fear that there would be retaliation, economic retaliation, for publicly expressing their opinion. So a good example of this is from Barbara. And Barbara is a real estate agent in the community. And she told me that for real estate, there's a pretty big risk in her letting potential clients know her political beliefs. And so she said she just kind of picks and chooses her battles, and she just doesn't let anybody know her political beliefs because it's not worth it. She really envisions that clients could potentially not work with her or retaliate against her for expressing her beliefs. I I also heard this from Roberta, who actually owns a local business in town. And she told me that she thought if she let people know she was a Democrat, or if she let people know her beliefs on politics, which were different from the majority, that she would have some type of, retaliation taken after the business. And here she even talks about coming out of the closet, right? If she were to come out of the closet, so to speak, that she worries people would take after the business. And so this coming out of the closet thing, I'll speak to a little bit later, but it kind of obviously harkens back to some of these other marginal identities and the language of identity sharing and negotiation from gay liberation and the queer movement. And so really some interesting overlap here in terms of this is a group of who are not marginalized in many other ways, but here they are using similar language from these other groups. So the last fear that I heard was probably the most striking, and it's something that I didn't quite anticipate when I found this group, that there would be an actual fear of physical retribution or violence for their expressions of dissent. And some of this ranged from having something vandalized, whether that was their car for putting on a bumper sticker, a yard sign, to actually having their property shot at or being run off the road for having a bumper sticker on their car. And so this is something that I didn't quite expect. So for instance, Linda told me in 2017, I asked her, well, why would you not want to put a yard sign out in your front yard? And she told me, well, that's kind of a fear of the unknown. I think I live in an area with people who carry guns in their car. And she told me that she had the experience of having 2 of her animals shot at when she did put a yard sign out. And so from this, I was kind of aware that there was not just this, oh, I'm afraid they're going to not invite me to the, knitting club anymore. This is a far different experience and a departure from this fear of being socially isolated to being afraid of actually being attacked or having violence posed against you. When I asked members again in 2018, would you be willing to put out a yard sign for kind of a popular candidate, Democratic candidate in the community, Beto O'Rourke, who was running for Senate at the time? They said they would still not put the sign out. They were afraid. Barbara said she was afraid someone would shoot it or something of that nature. And she wouldn't put a sticker on her car because she's afraid someone would run her off the road. So again, some elements here of not just this like spiral of silence, I'm afraid of expressing myself because I don't want to be socially isolated, but being actually afraid of physical retaliation. And I think the really key distinction here is that these are not extreme people, right? This is a pretty average, mainstream Democrat, many of them white grandmothers who are afraid of making a public political statement, which is very different than someone who's potentially socially marginalized in terms of race, ethnicity, other identities, or somebody who has a very extreme political identity they're trying to publicly display. So I've spoken kind of to this fear that led them to the secrecy, but CWG and this group of women was not just individuals who were keeping their politics a secret. They were also a group who was choosing secrecy, right? They were negotiating and making that decision, which actually created a lot of tension over the years. So as I kind of followed them through their development and their continuation, I started to hear them talk about whether they wanted to remain a secret. And some of them thought that staying a secret and being a secret organization in their community was actually really valuable, if only because it offered an alternative to more of these public-facing spaces for politics in their community. So Audrey told me, I think if CWG people want to be out and loud, you can join another organization like the County Democratic Party and the other ones. So, if you're cool with that, that's badass, go do that. But go do that with them. So her point is, like, CWG offers a totally different experience because it is secret, that the party itself is public facing. And so by CWG remaining a secret, it offers an alternative space for political expression and engagement for people people like them in their community. So on the one hand, there were those people who really wanted to stay a secret. There were also people who wanted to go what they would say public, right? So that they should maybe take their beliefs to those in their community to let people know who is in this group. And a lot of this was driven by the idea that they would be able to gain power if they were to expose who was in the group to the people in their community. So one of my favorite quotes is from Nancy. And she told me she was very much against the idea that the group would be secret, that she really wanted to be out there and to tell the people in their community they were Democrats. And she said, well, wait, we're a room full of influential women in the county, and we should say that. We should be public and stand up and say, hey, look, it's me, I'm your neighbor, and I'm not some commie. So to her, there was some power in this like interpersonal contact that potentially could change the mind of people in their community, or at least kind of soften them, right, to the fact that there are Democrats among them. So while most of the book focuses on CWG and this kind of secret political organization in rural Texas, I also wanted to know, okay, this is one case. Is it possible that this is just an outlier, right? Are we just seeing secrecy in this one instance because this just happens to be a one-off example? So what I did was I also surveyed a representative sample of US adults, and I asked them two key questions that would get at some of the same things that I was hearing in CWG. The first question was, how often do people feel the need to hide their political conversations from those around them? And what I found was that 22% of Americans said they feel the need to hide their political beliefs or conversations, at least sometimes, from those around them. So if we think about this number, it's actually quite large. Like, it's a reasonable number of people who are saying they feel the need to hide their political beliefs. The second question that I asked is I asked people if they had joined a private group in person or online to secretly discuss politics. And I found that 9% of people, of Americans, had done this in the past 2 years. So interestingly enough, there were no major differences across party. So in other words, Democrats and Republicans in the US were equally likely to say they felt the need to hide their political beliefs, or that they had joined a private group online or in person. So what this told me is that this isn't explained by some national phenomenon, right? That, well, maybe Republicans are just scared, or maybe Democrats are just scared. And it told me that it has no difference nationally what's happening, but that it probably has something to do with the context in which people are in. So this also told me that, like CWG, the survey data says that people feel the need to withhold their beliefs, but that there are still those that strategically express them in some contexts and not in others. So from these experiences, I made kind of 3 deductions here. One is that fear is contextual, right? That the risk to expressing yourself is not equal across contexts. A Democrat in rural Texas faces a different level of risk in expressing their beliefs than a Republican does. This also tells us, because fear is contextual, that secrecy is contextual, right? That people's choice to hide their conversations or behavior, which is driven by fear and stigma, is dependent upon where they are. So we might expect that if the Democrat in rural Texas is experiencing greater fear of expressing their beliefs, that they're also more likely to engage in political secrecy because of that contextual fear. And kind of the inverse of that, right, is that secrecy is contextual, but so is expression. That if we just think about expression as a blanket across all contexts, that we're really missing the layers there, right? That people have a choice of where they get to express themselves. And in some instances, they may engage in secrecy, and in some instances, they don't. And so we need to think about expression, not just as this aggregate thing that people do across all contexts, but that it's actually really very much embedded in where people are and the fear that they experience in those contexts. So when I started this work, as I mentioned, I had very much approached it from this idea of silence. And this is because, for the most part, research on political expression and communication has been very disconnected from the work on secrecy. So when we talk about politics and political communication and how people express their political beliefs, we tend to focus on who we do talk to about politics. So most of the research on political expression has looked at discussion networks and even used methods called like the name generator method that asks people to list who they talk to, not who they don't talk to about politics. And then on the other side, that when we look at the lack of expression, it's tended to focus on complete silence as some type of dichotomous outcome, right? That people either totally express what they think about politics publicly, or they're just silent altogether. And this kind of false dichotomy is where I think research on secrecy is actually really helpful in informing political communication research, to think about context and how people traverse these multiple contexts. So while political communication has tended to overlook secrecy, there are other areas of communication research that I've actually looked at it pretty extensively. So interpersonal communication has really done a lot of work on secrecy and interpersonal relationships, like romantic relationships and family relationships. They've defined secrecy or secrets as information that's purposely hidden or concealed. They find that people may keep interpersonal secrets as an effort to kind of bond or maintain privacy, but that secrecy tends to hurt interpersonal relationship satisfaction as well as interpersonal trust. And so the research on interpersonal secrecy is actually a really strong line of looking at how people manage information and identity, except it's not specific to politics, right? Another area of work that is actually really helpful when we think about secrecy is work from sociology. And they have been thinking about secrecy back to foundational work from Semmel around how people coordinate secrecy with others. There's also some work around covert or secret networks and how we can kind of define secret networks or covert networks, which, to sum up, is really hard because there's different levels of coordination. And so it's hard to know exactly like what is covert or what is secret. Some work from Craig Scott, if you're not familiar, he's an organizational communication scholar, has kind of tried to classify secret networks along continuum. But again, it's hard because some of these examples are, very specific, and it's hard to know the degree to which a group is coordinating together and what level of secrecy they engage in. We also know that secrecy tends to hurt organizations. There's something called the secrecy efficiency trade-off, so that because these are secret groups, they're inherently limited in their ability to recruit or to engage in outreach. And this is something I certainly saw happening with CWG, and something that I speak to a little bit more in the book. So while interpersonal communication and sociology have really dove into secrecy as a concept and as something to explore specifically related to how people coordinate around politics, political communication research has tended to just kind of step around that term and not really engage with secrecy as a concept. So we have some research on how elites may use secrecy to disguise their goals or cover up their behavior. I'm thinking even here of work from SPIN researchers who are looking at international security or cybersecurity and how elites use secrecy to kind of manage information and identity. On the mass side of things, we have research that tells us that people who are socially or politically marginalized are likely to engage in secrecy. And this is kind of the foundation of marginalization is the foundation of secrecy, right? I'm thinking of work from Scott on the antebellum South, work from the gay liberation movement. So these socially marginalized identities are very much rooted in the history of secrecy and why people feel the need to engage in it. And it's certainly something I see reflected in the experiences of CWG, right? Like even just how they talk about coming out of the closet as a Democrat kind of harkens to those same origins of secrecy amongst marginalized communities. On the other hand, on the political sense, we often see secrecy discussed in the context of politically extreme individuals, right? So for instance, the far right is getting a lot of attention, particularly in how they use digital media to coordinate and engage in political expression and political behavior. Yet in the case of CWG and in the argument in my book, that marginalization is not limited to people on the far right or the far left. It's not limited to those who are just socially marginalized, but that people can be politically marginalized locally, but nationally be very mainstream, right? Republicans and Democrats, that's like the two foundational parties of the United States, yet here's one of those foundational mainstream parties that's being locally marginalized, even though they currently are in the executive office. So as I tried to kind of grapple with these ideas of how we can think about political silence versus secrecy, it struck me that really the difference between these two is that one of them is found, right? In other words, that people may appear silent in one context, but that doesn't mean that they're silent in all contexts. That just because we cannot see the political expression doesn't mean it isn't there. And so my goal from the book and from the data that I kind of discussed was to come up with a phenomenon that can help us account for how people traverse these contexts. So in the book, I posed this idea of network silence, which says that people strategically express or withhold their beliefs in some contexts and not in others. And this is rooted in the idea that people are part of multiple communities and multiple networks. And from this, I draw from the sociological research of Barry Wellman with his theory of networked individualism. And from being part of multiple networks and communities, it's given individuals choice, right? We get to decide, well, I think I'll express myself to my coworkers because I feel like they share my beliefs, but I won't express myself to my family because they don't share my beliefs. And so the choice of selecting a network is really key to where we experience fear and where we don't. So I may choose to express my beliefs to my coworkers because I'm not afraid they're going to ostracize me for being a Democrat because they are also Democrats, right? Whereas I may choose to not express myself to my family, even though they're my family. I fear some type of retaliation for expressing a different opinion from them. And this all brings us to the idea that we get to be strategic, right? We get to decide where we express ourselves and where we don't, and that secrecy can be really helpful in keeping us kind of compartmentalized in those groups. So my argument with network silence is not that we have all the answers to why and how people express their beliefs in one context and not in another, but that we need to know about both spaces, right? If we want to know why people express themselves and why they don't, then we need to know not just about the places where they do express themselves, we also need to know about the places where they don't and the differences between those two. So from my theorizing and from the data that I present in the book, I thought I would speak a little bit today to what this means for our understanding of political secrecy and what this means for our role as researchers. So one of the things that kind of pops up for me here, as I mentioned earlier, was that secrecy exists both online and offline. But these two things are not independent, right? CWG had a secret Facebook group, but met offline. And oftentimes we approach research thinking about these two things as distinct. You either study digital media or you study offline contexts. But in reality, they're really interdependent. And in fact, there really are instances where people use digital media to afford them privacy they can't get offline. And that makes these kind of boundaries between these two spaces really blurry, and kind of should ask us to think about how we're approaching research to make sure we're not just looking at online or just looking at offline, but how these two things can kind of interact together. It's also true that secrecy depends on collaboration and agreement, right? CWG consistently negotiated and frequently revisited the idea that they would be a secret organization, which means we really need to understand how people interact and come to decisions together, right? A lot of research has focused on networks of secret or covert organizations, but misses the actual communication between people in those organizations. So we need to know not just who's involved and how they build a network, but what happens within the network or the community itself. As with the women of CWG, their ideology was not marginal at the national level, right? They were a group of moderate grandmothers with part of a major party in the United States, but yet they felt local marginalization from their community. So what that tells us is that if we want to know about secrecy, we have to look at the context surrounding it, right? And I think this is something that sociology and research around secrecy within that field has done a really, really good job with, and something that political communication and political expression research really hasn't quite grappled with, that we need to look at people in their immediate environments, not just at aggregate data, to get a sense of where are they fearful, right? Where are they marginalized? And the other thing that I would say is that secrecy is changing, right? That we need to potentially reevaluate our assumptions about who participates in secrecy. Oftentimes when I present this work, we think about secrecy as something associated with, maybe clandestine organizations, something that is some antisocial organization. But this is a group that is very much pro-social, pro-democratic in this case, and engaging in secrecy. I made this argument several weeks ago when I gave a talk on the January 6th insurrection at the US Capitol. And what's interesting is that CWG and the participants in the Capitol insurrection used the exact same tools, right? They used secret channels of communication, which were enabled by digital media, like a secret Facebook group. But they approached these tools with vastly different goals, right? One of them was very pro-social and one of them very anti-social. So when we think about secrecy, we need to think about our assumptions of its normative value. It can certainly cause harm. It can lead to coordination that is antisocial, but it also really just depends on who is engaging in it and to what end. I think this work also asks us to think a little bit about our methodology, right? And how we methodologically approach the study of secrecy. This is one of my favorite quotes and one that I put in the book that asks us to think a lot about, what data are we using and what is it really telling us? So sociologist Pauline Bart said that data everywhere, not a thought to think. And I think this says a lot about the kind of data we use to study political expression and secrecy. and whether it's really getting us the information we need. So my question really is, how do our current methods prioritize public expression and behavior? I'm thinking of methodologies that ask us to scrape websites or social media platforms. That gives us public expression and coordination, but it doesn't give us any access to private expression and coordination. And so here we might think, maybe we need to expand our methods to more qualitative or observational routes, right? To understand how people are interacting in these private spaces, which we don't get by just taking aggregate data from a website. There's also questions about who are we assuming is marginalized, right? And I've said this before, that social and political power is contextual, that if we want to understand people who feel marginalized, we have to look at specific contexts. We cannot just assume that from some type of larger picture of national data or aggregate data. And the other thing I think that this kind of flags for us is, how do we do this work in a way that is ethical, in a way that protects the privacy and identities of our participants, right? Institutional review boards like IRB are helpful in gaining compliance, but they often have these kind of inconsistent rules for studying secrecy across institutions. In one institution, it may be okay to do one thing, and another, it's not okay to do that same thing. And so my point with this question is that ethics should be a part of this larger conversation. Is it ethical to lurk in secret online communities? Do we have an obligation to identify ourselves? I think political communication and political science research has been really guilty of overlooking ethics in these conversations. And that needs to be central to this, particularly as our ability to access secret spaces for communication are expanding, right? As digital media makes that potentially easier to find or to collect data from these spaces, we need to be thinking about privacy and ethics alongside that. And I'd like to close out just to think about kind of the implications, not just for secrecy and our understanding of secrecy in terms of research, but also our understanding of this in terms of practice and how we can apply our understanding here to actual practice of politics. If you have not read the book Politics at the Margins by Susan Herbst, I highly recommend it. It looks at the historical and contemporary alternative and counterpublics kind of through the lens of Habermas. And she makes a really beautiful point, which is that if we want to grasp the complex nature of public opinion, ignoring social context and the dialogues of communities, marginal or not, is to fool ourselves. And I think this brings us to this point where we need to think about how we're conceptualizing the public in practice and in research in ways that potentially holds us back. So when we think about understanding secrecy in practice, we might look at political parties and organizations. How do they privilege public-facing acts? In what ways are parties limiting themselves by only encouraging public expression and not giving people alternative spaces to engage in more private political participation and expression? We can also think about how journalists are implicated in this, right? Journalists often use social media like Twitter as a way to gather public opinion. That is inherently relying on public-facing expression and how they are assessing and purveying public opinion in their coverage. I'm thinking of how many articles I've seen where journalists literally screenshot like a tweet and put it in their article as an example of public opinion. When in reality, like that is just a public side, but not the only side of what people are thinking about politics. And the last kind of implicated group that I'll speak to here is the role of platforms. And this is something that I think I've started to grapple with a little bit more, but it's certainly we need more work on, which is the role that platforms play in mediating secrecy, right? How do platforms create spaces for secrecy? If they are facilitating it, then what does that mean for who participates in secrecy and who's allowed to have a secret political engagement? And also how they participate, right? The structure of the platform, the space itself. What are the effects of being part of these platform mediated spaces, secret spaces, for what people do in other contexts, right? By being part of a secret political organization on Facebook, does that affect your behavior in other contexts? And you know, for the platforms themselves, if they are facilitating secrecy, what obligation do they have to monitor, to challenge, to protect the people who are using these spaces for expression and for coordination? So I will close there, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Emily. That's a really rich and fascinating talk and raises so many important questions. Okay, I can see that we've got some questions in the chat already, so that's great. We've got about 8 or 9 minutes. Perhaps we'll take 10 minutes, and if people need to leave at 4 on the dot, then please do. Okay, so let's have a look. A question from Anna. Okay, so a question here about the kind of gender breakdown in your survey data. So Anna says, of the 22%, the 9% who feel the need to keep their politics private, do you know how that was gendered? Was there a kind of a gender dynamic in that group who said that they kept their politics secret?
Yeah, this is a great question, because it was a hypothesis that I had that there would be differences across these things. And I didn't find it. Like, there was nothing consistent within gender, race, party, no consistent differences in who was reporting this. When I did measure fear of social isolation using some of the scales from spiral of silence theory. And when I did plug that into the model, we saw gender become significant. So there, to me, that told me, okay, there's something to gender relating to your fear of at least social isolation that's affecting your willingness to be public. But that wasn't totally clear. Like, I'd have to do more digging, but that's my suspicion, is that those two variables are much closely related than just gender and feeling the need to hide. So more of social isolation as a mediator, if that makes sense.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Anna, for these questions. They're really interesting and kind of touch on some of the questions I've got as well. So let me ask the second one as well, actually. You talked a bit about the fear that people felt, the reasons why people felt the need to be secretive. And that one of those was to do not just with social isolation, but safety as well. And Anna asks, was that just about kind of safety in the public sphere, or was there also a dynamic there where it was more private, more kind of behind closed doors, domestic violence, or kind of in sort of that more interpersonal conflict, I suppose?
Yeah, I love this question. So there certainly was an interpersonal dynamic, and I mentioned that some of the members had husbands who were supporting Donald Trump or were very much on the other political side from them. There were several divorces throughout the course of the organization, and from me following them and kind of over time, I heard of several divorces and spoke to them about that. So there was this kind of negative, kind of dark side to this, where interpersonally they did kind of fear either argument. I wouldn't go as far to say, violence or domestic violence in their relationships, but certainly conflict and argument within their relationships was something that drove them to secrecy. And in future iterations of this work, I've actually started to look at spousal suppression as a motivator to secrecy, right? So if we are in relationships where we are with a partner who doesn't share our beliefs, does that lead us to be more secretive in our political lives? Because we do either fear our partner's conflict with us or our partner objecting to our beliefs. And to that point, gender plays a very critical role, right? That women are very much more affected by differences in political beliefs in their relationships and are more likely to hide their politics from their partner than are men. So that is certainly an area of research that we need more of.
Yeah, it just raises so many interesting questions. I wish we had more time really, but I want to just pick up on something that you talked a little bit about how we actually do this research on secrecy. And I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about your experience with CWG in particular. You're looking at a group that by definition almost is closed and is private. What did that mean for you as an outsider in some ways, kind of gaining access to the group? And was there secrecy at play in how people kind of responded to you or interacted with you?
Yeah, that's a good question. There was, and I think part of the reason why this work is so hard, right? Studying secrecy at all is hard is because it's hard to find. And part of the way we get access to these groups or individuals is by trust. And so that's where I think qualitative research is actually really helpful in this regard because you're a person. And so when I first heard about the organization through a mutual connection, I just had to call them and be like, I promise I'm normal and we can just talk and I'm not going to quote you and this is just off the record. And I had to build the relationship before I was able to get into the room. And I actually spoke to them for 3 or 4 months before they allowed me to come to a meeting. So, it is very much about interpersonal trust in this field of study. And I think that's where qualitative research can be really helpful in understanding these phenomenon. And it was helpful that I was a white woman with a democratic leaning ideology, right? There was no threat of me. They were worried about opening it up to men because they thought they would risk getting a Republican in the group. And so it was helpful that I could blend in a little bit more and I didn't have this kind of posed threat to the group itself. So it was a process and it was absolutely built on trust and time and persistence. And I would not have been able to do that had I just emailed them a link to a survey and been like, please talk to me through this, 15-minute survey and then ended it there. It wouldn't have been as rich and I would not have been able to have this longitudinal understanding of their experiences.
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting questions around methodology there as well. Okay, we are almost out of time, but if I can, I'll just ask one question, and if people need to start kind of filtering out to get to the next appointment, that's no problem at all. But for those who can hang around just for a couple of minutes, I just want to kind of perhaps wrap up with a question that Lucas has put in the chat. So Lucas says, and lots of comments saying this is really fascinating research, really thought-provoking, so thank you. I'd like to ask about the normative implications of the research. So doesn't democracy depend on deliberation? Are we at risk of locking people even more inside their ideological bubbles? How to balance the understandable need for secrecy with the democratic need to debate politics? Yes, I love this. Totally, right? This is a very messy normative implication. The answer is not secrecy is it. It's great. Everyone should do this, right? Because in the book, I have a whole chapter on there were really two sides of this. One, it insulated the women. It made them want to get divorced from a husband who shared different political beliefs from them because they were fired up about feeling, like they were in the minority. It made them more fearful of their community in some ways as they got together with other people and exchanged all of these narratives that oh, I got run off the road. Oh, I got someone vandalized my yard sign. It just kind of amplified their fears.
So on the one hand, totally, it's insulating to be in these kind of deliberative enclaves in some way. But on the other hand, it actually was really incubating. So for many of them, being part of this group gave them a sense of power. What they would say is they came out as Democrats to their community. They joined the party. They participated in public political acts. So there's no real like, oh, this is normatively a great thing, or this is normatively a bad thing. It can do both. It can insulate and it can incubate. And so I think this idea of really we want people to be out there is absolutely true. We want people to be public and deliberating, and the public element of expression is super important to democracy. I think my argument would be, in some ways, this may be the way we get there, right? That if people start in these secret groups, if they have a place that feels safe to learn about politics, to practice talking about politics, that we might see them be more likely to be public in their deliberation. That maybe this is the kind of middle ground between those two.
Great. Well, that feels like a nice place to wrap up, I think. So thank you so much again, Emily, for a really fascinating talk. Thank you for everyone who's asked questions. I'm sorry we didn't get around to all of them, but yeah, I think we've had some really interesting discussions. So thanks very much, everyone, and see you soon.